Teaching and learning is always a step-by-step process, and we're all engaged in that in some part of our life in different ways. It never ends. And when we think about training and teaching, there are at least three elements that are present in any form or any occasion or any skill that's being trained. There is always the process of convincing and rebuking and exhorting. Now, we might think about those as Bible words, but really they are universal principles that apply to any occasion of teaching and of training. So think about those three words. To convince, when you try to convince someone of something, you're sharing information, you're giving ideas for the purpose of persuading someone not just to have the same idea, but then to do something with it. So you want them to be convinced of that, and so you might present some kind of evidence. You may share some information. You may give some examples. You may show them the consequences of one idea versus another idea. You do whatever you can, depending on how important it is to you, to convince them. And then training always involves rebuke in one way or another, and rebuke doesn't have to the various degrees of the strength and intensity of some rebuke, but all rebuke is pointing out something that is wrong. And so identifying the problems of that as a means of pointing someone's mind back to what is right. And then to exhort, again, that's maybe one of these words we think of mainly as a Bible word that maybe we don't use in any other occasion. But it isn't limited to that. Exhorting, or maybe a more common word would be to urge. It's not, you rarely are introducing any new idea when you're urging someone. You already gave the new information when you convinced them. When you exhort them or you urge them, you're just trying to persuade them further, now that they know already what is right, to continue in that. So if you've ever taught the alphabet, then you convinced and you rebuked and you exhorted and you urged. You convinced when you showed the letters, and kids in the bathtub, they've got the little foam things. That's convincing, that's teaching. And then when they sing the song and they say A, C, B, D, you rebuke them mildly, not a punishment associated with it, but, well, no, it's A, B, C, and then you go on. You convinced and then you rebuked, and then however many times that you were in the vehicle and you had that song, singing on the radio, and throughout the day it was stuck in your head. Why were you doing that? Well, you were urging, you were encouraging them, you were exhorting them. Now, you're learning it, or you've learned it, and let's keep remembering these are the letters that we need to know. If you've taught the alphabet, if you've taught someone to shoot a gun or how to shoot a ball, if you've taught the gospel, what you have done on every occasion is you have convinced and rebuked and exhorted. That's the universal process. There may be some other ways you could describe it, but these are three elements that are present universally in any kind of teaching and training. This morning and tonight, I want to think about those three elements and focus on applying those in our home, in the teaching and training that we do within the family. And you don't even have to be married or have children to see the application of these principles in a variety of ways. And whatever your relationship is, it may be as a Bible class teacher. It may be as a friend. It may be as an aunt or an uncle, a parent, a grandparent. Regardless of our relationship, we all have different opportunities and relationships. And among the best things we can do with those relationships is continue the process of teaching and of training. And so I want us to think about how convincing and rebuking and exhorting apply in the kind of training that parents and that others are doing for children. This process, first of all, has to begin early. We have to convince and rebuke and exhort early. We read 2 Timothy 3 and verse 14, and here I want to just key in on the word that Paul says, from childhood. Verse 15. Childhood. That word child or childhood in the Greek language in which Paul was writing is just as general a word as the English word child is. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 41, remember when Mary went to visit Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was already pregnant with John, and she said that Elizabeth said that when Mary came in, the babe leapt in her womb. You remember that? That word babe, describing the child in her womb, is the same word as Paul describing Timothy, knowing the Holy Scriptures from childhood. So I'm just saying that this is a broad word covering the whole scope of childhood. It's used in Luke 18 and verse 15 of infants, when parents were bringing their infants to Jesus just so he could hold them and bless them. It's the same word, as well as we read it in class, Acts 7 verse 19, when Stephen was reviewing the history of Israel and refers to Moses and the time the time in which he was in his youth. So Paul describes Timothy as knowing the Holy Scriptures from childhood. So the point is that we begin early and we convince. The process of convincing our children begins as soon as there is life in it to some degree. And then, of course, it has to continue at every phase of life. Think about convincing. When do you begin the process of convincing your children? Well, again, going back to Luke chapter 1 and verse 41, the babe that was within Elizabeth's womb was able to do what? The babe responded when he heard. Babies can hear in the womb, can't they? That was already mentioned there. Now, today, there are people who have studied that, and it's interesting. The experts say that child especially can hear the mother's voice, of course, most clearly, and can recognize, can distinguish the mother's voice from other voices, even while in the womb, and then can hear with varying degrees of clarity other voices. Have you ever thought about the fact that you begin to convince your child of whatever you're going to teach them, but that process begins even while they're in the womb because they can hear? Now, I don't mean that they can understand yet, but the point is you're laying a foundation. They begin there by hearing your voice and recognizing your voice and even being able to distinguish a mother's voice especially, maybe a father's voice, I don't know, but especially a mother's voice from any other voice. What do they hear a mother's voice doing? Now, to one degree, again, I understand they don't understand the words, so we might say it doesn't matter, but does the convincing process not start if, even in the womb, the baby is hearing the voice of a mother singing, praying, even reading Scripture? Did you ever, or would you read Scripture, mothers, to your child while still in your womb? There could be a good reason to do that is the beginning of the process of convincing that child consistent with their ability. All they can really do is hear, they can't yet understand, but they can hear. That's something. That's the beginning of the process of convincing. And then, of course, they're born, and as an infant or even as a toddler, the process of convincing needs to continue, not really begin. It needs to continue even at that phase. And again, we think, well, but they can't really understand very much. Well, we continue to realize as parents we don't always grasp how much they are grasping. They obviously often are getting more than we realized. But even at that early phase, parents are convincing their children by introducing key words. And children at every phase, when they hear God mentioned in the home as a part of the family, when God is included in the family on a daily basis, then it's just like what we do with other members of our family who maybe don't live in our home. Maybe they live in the same town, or maybe they live far away. but don't you talk about in your home members of your family who are not present with you? Of course you do. You talk about mom and dad, your own, or their parents, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles. They're just included in the daily conversation and in our daily life because they are an essential, integral part of our family. And so children, even as infants and as toddlers, what Moses tells the Israelites to do in Deuteronomy chapter 6, when you come in, when you go out, talk about these things. Even infants and toddlers are beginning to build a vocabulary based upon the words that they hear and who they hear about. And again, at first we might think, yeah, but we'll give that teaching and instruction later when they can understand it. But actually, the process of teaching children at that phase, we're already introducing them to words that they don't understand. And we tell them to say things that they don't understand. Every mother loves to hear their child say, "I love you." Well, in reality, they're just repeating what you told them to say. They don't know what it means. But we still like to hear it, don't we? We tell them to say, "I'm sorry," even before they know what it means. Why are we doing that? We are building a vocabulary. We're giving them the words that they need to use in order to function in this world. And we're directing their minds in certain things by the words that we give them. So yes, we teach them words, not just that they hear, but we teach them to say words before they actually understand what it means, because that's a part of the teaching process. And so we do that in things like "I love you" or "thank you." But then think about the importance of doing that at every phase in other areas. Genesis 1:1, when is it too early for them to be able to say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," or some portion of that? As soon as they can, that's adding something that will help them. You're adding something that is distinct from what they're going to be hearing. And you're adding something that is essential to them understanding the world that they live in and that they're learning about, regardless of what those words are. That begins as early as you'll introduce it to them. Now, of course, as they grow, they'll hear those verses from maybe a Bible class teacher and maybe a preacher or a song leader, and from the songs that they sing or that they hear. They're going to get that from somewhere. But from whom is it most important that they get that? From whom is it most important that they hear that? They will hear it from others, but it's most important that they hear that from you. In the process of beginning early to convince. The process of teaching also involves rebuke. The Old Testament gives a few examples that we refer to from time to time of the serious consequences of failing to rebuke. You remember Eli, the priest Eli, in 1 Samuel chapter 3. You know a different Eli, don't you? But in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 13, Samuel was sent to give Eli a message. And what was it? God told Samuel, "I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them." Eli wasn't participating in it, but his sons were, and he knew it, and he did nothing about it. And doing nothing was a problem. And God was holding him accountable for his part of that. Also look at 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 6. When we think about the failures of the life of David, there are some that stand out and maybe are more notable. But 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 5 and 6 says, "Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith," and Haggith is his mother, "exalted himself, saying, 'I will be king.' And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him." This is before David has died. And Adonijah is saying, I'm going to be the next king. I'll make the decision. Why did he do that? Verse 6 tells us part of the answer. And his father, which is David, had not rebuked him at any time by saying, why have you done so? And then this is an interesting note. He also was very good looking. Priests and kings have failed to rebuke their children. And in Adonijah, we get a glimpse into the consequences of that. Look at Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24. Maybe a familiar proverb. Proverbs 13 and verse 24. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. I'm using the New King James. I don't know what version you use. Whatever it is, though, do you have a different word or do you have a footnote at the end of that verse? Disciplines him promptly. My footnote says early. And so the translators weren't sure. Disciplines him early or disciplines him promptly. It can mean either one. So I don't know if the proverb is emphasizing he who loves him disciplines him promptly, meaning close in time to the offense. But this might also be saying disciplines him early in his life. Early in the offense or early in his life. It could be either one, but both would be true, wouldn't they? Early in their life and promptly, as children, they're experimenting with the path of obedience and the path of disobedience. And again, as a child grows and develops, I think every parent has always been surprised that, wow, they can't say anything, but boy, they understand. And one of the blessings of that phase of life is in their youth, they're experimenting with these two paths and the consequences of each path, and yet their decisions don't affect their relationship with God in their youth, of course. And so God is giving this time where they can learn the path and the consequences of obedience. They can learn the path and the consequences of disobedience. How do they learn? Well, part of the way they learn is by parents who rebuke. And this passage reminds us not to be deceived by the age-old saying, well, I love my child too much to. No, this says just the opposite. If you love him, discipline him early, promptly. That's the kind of love. That's the kind of love that is effective in training and essential in the home. Convince, rebuke, and exhort. And I meant to mention this earlier, but you might recognize that's actually taken from 2 Timothy 4, verse 2, where Paul was telling Timothy how to do the work of an evangelist. Preach the word, convince, rebuke, and exhort. But that wasn't a special spiritual formula. He was just telling Timothy, go and preach the word, and the way that you teach this is really the same as you teach any other method. And so, of course, that's where these 3 points come from. Convince, rebuke, and then also exhort. The book of Proverbs is full of exhortations, again, of statements that are made in order to urge. The majority of the things that are said in the book of Proverbs are not said there for the first time. Most of what you can read in Proverbs, you can go and read elsewhere that God expects this to be done or expects this not to be done. But the book of Proverbs is primarily written, look at Proverbs chapter 1. It's primarily written as a father who is teaching his son and not always introducing something new, but many times he's just saying, I want you to remember what I have taught you. And so Proverbs 1 verse 8, my son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. Look at chapter 2 verse 1. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you. So he's urging him. He's not necessarily introducing something. He's just urging him, exhorting him, remember what I have told you and keep it. Chapter 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my law. Chapter 4, verse 1, hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding. And you can read chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 20, chapter 7, verse 1. The first 7 chapters of the book of Proverbs, about a quarter of the entire book, is written as a father exhorting his son. So, of course, God is the best urger, the best exhorter that there is. And so we see how God exhorts through the words of Solomon, Moses, the prophets. But think about Paul, the Apostle Paul. We don't often think about getting parental advice from Paul, of course, because he was never married. He didn't have children. But in reality, when we read his letters, the way that he writes teaches us, I think, some things about exhorting. Think of especially the books of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, and Titus. There are some things that we can learn from Paul about how to exhort, and then we can apply that to exhorting our children. And again, these are not even things, though I'm mentioning here, it has to begin early. This continues throughout their life, even when our children are grown, consistent with our relationship. While that changes in some ways, that process never really ends. But Paul, think about those letters. He convinces, and Paul rebukes. 1 Corinthians maybe is the most notable of that. But think about how often Paul's letters are exhortations, where he writes to brethren and encourages them because they are doing what is right. And he's just reminding them of things they already knew, and he's really just urging them to continue doing those things. Sometimes he's praising them. Sometimes he's just telling them about the trials, the struggles, the hardships that he's having because he's writing from prison, or because of some way that he's being opposed by someone who is opposed to the gospel. Sometimes he's sharing news of joy, that he expects things to get better. Maybe he's going to be released from prison, or he's been refreshed by some help that they have sent. In all of this, he's filling their minds with the reasons for, or with what is happening and the reasons for those things happening. And he's just encouraging them. He's urging them. Here's how things are with me, and I'll serve God. How are things with you? Or here's how I've heard things are with you. Keep the faith and keep your confidence in Him. I think we can apply much of this, that it's important that we exhort our children. Maybe we primarily think, but our job is to teach them, to convince them, and to rebuke them. That's the main two things. That's a part of it, but once we teach them what is right, and then we have to correct them and bring them back when they go the other way. But it's equally important that we exhort them, that we urge them, that like Paul, we praise them for the things that they do that are right. And I can admit sometimes that's a challenge. It seems like, well, most of what I do is tell them what is wrong. And maybe that's the easier part. Equally important is to emphasize, to call their attention to, hey, look, here's what you did. Here's what is right. That's what you need to continue doing. That's what I need to see more of. That's what your brother, your sister, your father, your mother, that's what they need to see you doing. That's important. Sharing with your children, again, consistent with their abilities. How God has helped you in your struggles, just like Paul shared that with those to whom he wrote. Children need to hear from their parents. Here's what my struggles have been, and here's how God helped. Here's how we've had opportunities and blessings, and here's what God has provided. In all of this, you're filling their mind, you're urging them and giving them examples of why they ought to continue. Here are some of the immediate and short-term and long-term and eternal opportunities and benefits and blessings that will come if you will serve God. That's an essential part of teaching and of training. And every single day, if our mind is set on things above, God is giving parents and others who have relationships with children opportunities early to convince, to rebuke, and to exhort. Secondly, effective training. Training is effective when we recognize and remember and remind ourselves that growth is gradual. Again, just really keying in on the word back from 2 Timothy 3:15, Paul says, from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures. Paul doesn't just say, well, at this point in your childhood you knew the Holy Scriptures, but from childhood. So that began early, but that was something that continued. And just like is most obvious in physical things, growth is gradual, and at times it's almost impossible to perceive it when you see that child from day to day. The teaching and the training, that process is gradual. The process of convincing them is a gradual process, one in which you don't always tell them what they need to know, and they immediately understand what they need to know, and they immediately are convinced of what they need to know and keep it. It's a process. It's a slow process. But maybe convincing is the most enjoyable process, especially when children are young. Who doesn't love convincing their children that your parent loves you? How do you convince your children that you love them? Some of that is a very easy thing and a very rewarding thing. Other parts of that are more challenging. We love to convince our children, let your little light shine. That's an easy part of convincing, but that's really what that song and others like it are. And we teach our children that God made all things. That's a relatively easy and pleasurable teaching to convince our children. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then we go to something a little more challenging to them, of not just what God has done, but what God expects. Children, obey your parents and the Lord, for this is right. We begin by convincing them of these things. And that starts when they're young, but then over time it becomes more difficult, a little more complicated to some degree, because then they have to begin grasping things like Jesus is the Christ. What does that mean? We're in the process of convincing them. Jesus is also God. He's the Son of God. Well, how can Jesus be God, but he obeyed God? Parents have to work through helping their children to understand that and grasp that so that one day they can accept it. And then about introducing the Holy Spirit. And then of the importance of repenting and being willing to forgive, and then helping them to understand the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. Now, those things are not as easy as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But there has to be an ongoing process of convincing them. And that is a gradual process. And yet, isn't it another one of the rewarding parts of being a parent or a teacher in any way, when you see that light bulb moment, when something that you know you've been trying to drill and to get into their mind, when you notice, oh, they actually understand it now. That's rewarding. And then there's another time where not only do they understand it, now it's something that they actually believe for themselves. And that happens at different times and different phases. And so the convincing process is sometimes enjoyable at different times and in different ways, but it's ongoing. It's a process. The process of rebuke is also a process, and it's not as pleasant, and it often is not as immediately rewarding as the process of teaching, but it's just as essential in the process of training, and it's just as an essential element and expression of our love as the other part is, isn't it? I want us, though, to think about just for a moment that rebuke is also a process. And when we think about God, we recognize God rebuked. And sometimes we think most about God rebuking by punishing. But just very briefly, I wanted to remind us that God also had a process in rebuking. When we think about Israel, think about all that God did, the abundant ways that he convinced and that he even rebuked as he brought Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus. He rebuked Egypt in a variety of ways, the plagues and the things that followed. But then as Israel crossed the Red Sea and as they began to travel in Exodus chapter 15, if I looked correctly, this is the first time where they complain about being thirsty. And what happened when Israel complained about being thirsty? The first time, God didn't punish them. The first time they complained about it, God just provided water. Exodus 15, 24 and 25. Then in Exodus 16, verses 3 and 4, again they complain. And you know what God does the second time they complain? He provides what they need. In Exodus 17, they complain again. You know what God does this time when they complain? The third time, at least, that we're told. He just provides what they need. There isn't a plague, no one that we're told of, no one dies. But then we get to Exodus 19, and now Moses is at the mountain, at Mount Sinai. And as he goes up on the mountain, then they build the golden calf, and God rebukes that as well. But this time, his rebuke is a punishment. Some are killed, but not everybody is killed. Aaron was instrumental in that. He didn't die. You remember there was another form of rebuke and punishment. He ground up that idol and did what? And poured it into their water, and they had to drink it. So there were different forms of punishment on this occasion. Some were killed, and some just had that misery, and I don't know what the consequences of that was, but I suppose it extended beyond just the taste of their tongue. So then after some convincing and rebuking and exhortations at Mount Sinai, then they go on through the wilderness, and then it's in the book of Numbers that we maybe most vividly remember they complained and God punished them, and they complained and God punished them. So what I just want to remind us of is that rebuke, God's rebuke, allowed time for growth. There were different times and different ways in which he rebuked them. He was not always sending fire from the temple or from heaven and killing those who sinned. He always addressed it. He never ignored it. But God recognized growth is gradual, and so he used the tool with perfect wisdom of rebuke. And so God didn't see immediate results. As parents, we don't see immediate results when we convince. We don't see immediate results when we rebuke. But that's because growth is gradual. But there's a benefit to the process. Because based upon the things that you rebuke or you do not rebuke, your children are learning what you value. The things you rebuke them for, they understand that's something that's important to you. The things you do not rebuke them for, they're also learning to recognize, well, I guess that doesn't matter. And that the things that you rebuke them most strongly for, and the things that you rebuke less often or less severely for, they're also learning your priority and your values. So when you don't see the results, I just want to encourage you to remember they're still learning some things. And that's a slow process. And then last, growth is gradual, and effective training involves ongoing exhortations. The things in which we exhort our children, praise our children, remind our children, urge our children, set their expectations. It helps to set their goals. The things that we emphasize, that we tell them and we tell them again and we tell them again, not because they don't know, but because they don't remember or they don't act like they remember. Those things in which we urge them, not just in what's wrong, but the things in which are right. Again, even though we don't see immediate reactions or results, they're still learning. One person made this observation. Since the 1960s, parenting has shifted away from emphasizing obedience, honor, and respect for authority to promoting children's happiness while stoking their ambitions for material success. Notice that the title of this, you may not can see it, but studies find more students cheating with high achievers no exception. So maybe typically we think, well, the cheater is the one he's trying to get by so he can pass. But this says no. Even the students who excel, it's being seen in our society that they're cheating. Now, where does that come from? It comes because somebody is exhorting them, at least many times. It's coming from parents who are urging them, I want you to succeed. And they hear that, and maybe the parents don't say, and I want you to cheat to succeed. But what do they see in their parents? What do they see from their parents? They see a parent who will do almost anything to succeed, including lie, or deceive, cheat, be dishonest with their boss or with some customer or whomever. Children see that, don't they? Parents do not hide as well as we might think that we do. And so children have learned that their parents are success-focused, even to the point of dishonesty. And so children apply that in their own kind of work. And so the focus, just like the focus of your rebuke, also the focus of your exhortations is a part of what motivates your children. Think about Timothy. What do you think he was exhorted in by his mother? What do you think she not only rebuked him for, what do you think she urged him? What areas do you think she urged him in, encouraged him in, praised him in? But then we also remember Timothy also had a father. And all that is said about him is he was a Greek. What do you think his father urged him in, praised him for? What a difficult life for Timothy, receiving conflicting occasions of rebuke and of praise. Adonijah, remember David's son. David did not rebuke him, but again it mentions that he was good looking. What do you think he was praised for? But then what he was not praised for, and what he was rebuked for, and what he was not rebuked for, we don't have a chronicle of it all. We just see the results. And so think about the things that you record in one way or another, that you tell your family about, that you repeatedly tell your children about. Oh, I remember when you... There's a place for the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s and the hunting or athletic or academic accomplishments. I'm not saying ignore those things, but I'm just saying we exhort our children in those areas. Do we give at least equal, if not more, attention to their knowledge of God and their excelling and their preparation in that, and knowing the books of the Bible and knowing some simple memory verses, in their practice of the things that they learn? Something as simple as opening a door for a stranger, serving their mother, serving their father, their brother, their sister. They are learning what we as parents value and do not value, and they're learning what we value the most based upon the areas in which we not only rebuke them, but in which we exhort them. Convince, rebuke, and exhort, we most commonly associate that with the work of an evangelist. But an evangelist must do this, and elders must do this. But fathers and mothers must do this to effectively train their children in the Lord, for this is right. And when you do, maybe the hardest part is there are no guarantees about the way that our children will respond to the convincing and rebuking and years of exhortation. So why do we do it if there are no guaranteed results? Turn to number 284. We do it because this is what God has told us to do. We do what God has told us to do regardless of what we foresee or what we see the results are. We do these things to serve our God, to please our God, as parents. We'll continue this lesson tonight. I also have just a short article that you'll see I borrowed several points from. So I'll give everybody a copy if I brought enough of those. It's pretty short and simple, but just gives some other areas of study and thought on this subject. But turn to number 284. Just as we are teaching our children, in that same process, God is teaching us. God is training us. And as we reflect upon our relationship with our children, the easy application is to reflect upon God, our Father, and His process, His patience in training us. And when we come to the point in life, whether it's of age or of maturity, at whatever point we recognize that we have not obeyed our Father, we've not honored our Father, and we've sinned and we're separated from Him who loves us the most, then we need to respond by faith, repenting of our sins, confess what we believe with our mouth, and he that believes and is baptized will be saved. If you need to appeal to your Father for forgiveness, to become a Christian, to be brought to His family, or if you need to return to your Father as a prodigal son, and in some way we can help you, tell us how we could help and serve you as we stand and sing.